This silver watch stopped ticking at exactly 2:47 p.m. on March 15, 1869. But that's not what makes it disturbing. What makes it disturbing is that it was found clutched in the skeletal fingers of a man who had been dead for over 50 years, sitting perfectly upright at a desk in an office that was supposed to be empty. The office belonged to the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company, and the skeleton was wearing the uniform of a chief engineer. But according to company records, no one had worked in that office for decades. The discovery was made by renovation workers in downtown Denver in 1921, 52 years after the watch stopped. They were converting the old railroad building into modern apartments when they broke through a sealed wall and found something that shouldn't have existed. A perfectly preserved office from 1869, complete with maps spread across the desk, calculations written in fresh ink, and 2 coffee cups still sitting on the windowsill as if their owners had just stepped out for a moment. But there were no owners to step out. The office had been sealed since March 15, 1869, the same day 2 of Denver's most brilliant engineers vanished without explanation while working on the most ambitious railroad project in American history. Their names were James Morrison and Daniel Crawford, and they were about to change the course of westward expansion forever. Instead, they disappeared, leaving behind only questions and a stopped watch that would puzzle investigators for generations. To understand how 2 men could vanish from a sealed office 4 stories above a busy Denver street, we need to go back to the winter of 1869. Denver was exploding with growth. The Transcontinental Railroad was nearing completion, and every businessman in the country wanted a piece of the action. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company had just announced the most audacious engineering project of the era, a direct route through the Rocky Mountains that would cut travel time to California in half. The project was considered impossible by most engineers of the time. The route required tunneling through solid granite at elevations where men could barely breathe, building bridges across canyons that seemed to have no bottom, and somehow maintaining stable tracks through mountain passes where avalanches could bury entire trains in minutes. But James Morrison and Daniel Crawford weren't most engineers. They were pioneers who had already accomplished what others called impossible. Morrison, at 34, was the son of Irish immigrants who had worked his way from track layer to chief engineer through pure determination and mathematical genius. He had designed the suspension bridge over the Arkansas River that everyone said would collapse in the first strong wind. It still stands today. Crawford, 29, came from a wealthy Boston family but had abandoned comfort for adventure. He had spent 3 years in the California gold fields, not looking for gold, but studying the geology and mapping underground water systems that kept mining operations running. Together, they had spent 8 months surveying the proposed route, living in mountain camps through brutal winters, mapping every canyon and calculating loads for bridges that would span impossible distances. Their preliminary reports had excited investors and terrified competitors. If successful, their railroad would make Denver the gateway to the West and generate millions in revenue. But on March 15, 1869, something went wrong. Morrison and Crawford had been working in their private office since dawn, finalizing calculations for the mountain tunnels. Their secretary, a meticulous woman named Mrs. Elizabeth Harper, brought them coffee at 2:30 p.m. and noted that both men seemed excited about something they had discovered in their calculations. She was the last person to see them alive. When Mrs. Harper returned at 4 p.m. to remind them of a meeting with investors, the office was empty. The coffee cups sat untouched on the windowsill, steam no longer rising from the cooling liquid. Maps were spread across the desk as if the men had been studying them moments before. But the engineers were gone, and there was no way they could have left. The office was on the 4th floor of a building with no fire escape. The only entrance was through a door that Mrs. Harper could see from her desk in the outer office. The windows faced a sheer drop to the street below, and none showed signs of being opened. Most puzzling of all, their coats still hung on hooks by the door, and their personal belongings remained scattered across the desk. No one leaves Denver in March without a coat. The initial investigation was led by Sheriff William Brennan, a former Union Army officer who had seen enough mysteries during the war to approach strange situations methodically. He sealed the office and began interviewing everyone who had been in the building that day. The results were baffling. 3 different witnesses had heard voices coming from the office as late as 3:45 p.m., less than 15 minutes before Mrs. Harper found it empty. The voices had been animated, as if the engineers were discussing something exciting. Building maintenance workers confirmed that no one had used the main stairway between 2:30 and 4 p.m. The freight elevator had been broken for a week. There were no other exits from the fourth floor. Brennan even examined the possibility that the men had somehow climbed through the building's ventilation system, but the ducts were far too small for grown men and showed no signs of disturbance. The investigation took an even stranger turn when Brennan discovered that Morrison and Crawford had made significant changes to their tunnel calculations in the hours before their disappearance. The original plans called for conventional boring techniques that would take years to complete. But their final notes, written in Morrison's distinctive handwriting, described a revolutionary excavation method using controlled explosions in precise sequences that could cut tunneling time by 70%. The technique was so advanced that modern engineers, examining the plans in 1921, could barely understand the mathematical principles involved. The calculations incorporated geological stress analysis and explosive timing that wouldn't appear in engineering textbooks until the early 20th century. Either Morrison and Crawford had made a breakthrough that was 50 years ahead of their time, or they had somehow acquired knowledge that shouldn't have existed in 1869. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that similar disappearances had occurred at other railroad companies across the country. Between 1867 and 1870, at least 12 prominent engineers working on transcontinental railroad projects had vanished under circumstances that defied explanation. In each case, the missing engineers had been working on revolutionary techniques that promised to solve previously impossible engineering challenges. In Sacramento, 2 engineers disappeared while designing a method to prevent avalanches in mountain passes. Their calculations described snow load dynamics and weather prediction models that wouldn't be developed until the 1920s. In Chicago, an engineer vanished after developing plans for underground railroad stations that incorporated ventilation and lighting systems decades ahead of their time. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: brilliant engineers working alone, revolutionary discoveries, and then sudden vanishing without trace. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company, faced with the loss of their chief engineers and the impossibility of completing the mountain route without their expertise, quietly abandoned the project. The revolutionary tunnel plans were sealed in company archives and forgotten. The building where Morrison and Crawford disappeared was converted to other uses, and their office was sealed behind a brick wall as if the company wanted to erase all memory of what had happened there. But memories have a way of persisting, especially in a city like Denver where stories travel through generations like veins of gold through mountain rock. Workers in the building reported strange occurrences over the decades. Sounds of voices and mechanical calculations echoing from behind the sealed wall. Blueprints that appeared overnight on desks in other parts of the building, drawn in handwriting that matched Morrison's distinctive style. Security guards reported seeing lights in the windows of the sealed office, even though no electricity had been connected to that section since 1869. When renovation workers finally broke through the wall in 1921, they found the office exactly as it had been left 52 years earlier. The calendar on the wall still showed March 1869. The ink in the inkwells had somehow remained liquid. And sitting at the desk, as if he had never left, was a skeleton in an engineer's uniform with that stopwatch clutched in its bony fingers. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. Dental records confirmed that the skeleton belonged to James Morrison. But Daniel Crawford was nowhere to be found. The office showed no signs of violence or struggle. There was no indication of how Morrison had died or why his body had remained undisturbed in a sealed room for half a century. Most puzzling of all, the calculations spread across the desk had been completed. The revolutionary tunnel plans that had been unfinished at the time of their disappearance now contained detailed solutions to every engineering challenge. Modern analysis of those plans revealed engineering techniques that wouldn't be developed until the mid-20th century. The calculations incorporated understanding of geological stress, explosive chemistry, and structural engineering that was decades ahead of 1869 knowledge. It was as if Morrison had continued working for 50 years, developing solutions that drew from scientific knowledge that didn't yet exist. The discovery made national headlines, but the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company, now under different ownership, moved quickly to control the narrative. They claimed the office had been used for storage and that the skeleton was probably a vagrant who had somehow accessed the building decades earlier. The revolutionary engineering plans were dismissed as the fantasies of an amateur inventor. Within weeks, the entire office was dismantled and its contents destroyed, officially ending the investigation. But unofficial investigations continued. Railroad historians and engineering professors became fascinated by the technical sophistication of Morrison's final calculations. They represented solutions to problems that had plagued mountain railroad construction for decades. Several concepts from those plans were eventually incorporated into modern tunnel building techniques, though few engineers realized they were using methods first conceived by a man who disappeared in 1869. The most disturbing aspect of the discovery wasn't what was found, but what was missing. Daniel Crawford's disappearance remained completely unexplained. Unlike Morrison, whose fate was at least partially resolved, Crawford had simply ceased to exist. No body, no personal effects, no trace of his presence after 2:47 p.m. on March 15, 1869. It was as if he had stepped out of reality itself. Over the years, various theories emerged to explain the engineer's fate. Some suggested they had been murdered by competitors who wanted to steal their revolutionary tunnel plans. Others proposed that they had faked their deaths to escape financial obligations or personal problems. But none of these theories could explain how Morrison's body ended up in a sealed office or how their engineering calculations had been completed using knowledge from the future. The most persistent theory, supported by several unusual pieces of evidence, suggested that Morrison and Crawford had stumbled upon something far more significant than improved tunnel building techniques. This theory proposed that their mathematical calculations had somehow opened a doorway to advanced knowledge from sources they couldn't understand or control. Supporters of this theory point to the impossible sophistication of their final plans, the reports of strange phenomena in the building over the decades, and the fact that similar disappearances occurred at railroad companies across the country during the same period. They suggest that the engineers, in their pursuit of revolutionary construction methods, had made contact with forces or intelligences that operated beyond normal understanding of time and space. Whether Crawford survived this contact and Morrison didn't, or whether both men were transported somewhere beyond our ability to follow, remains unknown. What is certain is that their disappearance changed the course of American railroad development. The revolutionary techniques they discovered were too dangerous or too advanced to implement in 1869, but their influence can be traced through decades of subsequent engineering innovations. Today, the building where Morrison and Crawford disappeared houses a modern office complex. The sealed office has been replaced by conference rooms and cubicles where computer programmers and marketing executives go about their daily business, unaware of the mystery that once unfolded 4 floors above the busy Denver streets. But sometimes, late at night when the building is quiet, security guards report hearing the faint sound of voices engaged in animated discussion, the scratch of pencils on paper, and the tick of a watch that stopped running more than 150 years ago. The ghost of American innovation, perhaps, still working on problems that may never be completely solved. The stopped watch from Morrison's skeletal hand was eventually donated to the Denver Museum of Natural History, where it sits in a climate-controlled case, its hands frozen at 2:47 p.m. Visitors often ask tour guides about the watch's significance, but few museum employees know the full story. The official placard simply identifies it as Railroad Engineer's Timepiece, circa 1869. But for those who know where to look, it represents something far more intriguing, a moment when human ambition reached beyond the possible and touched something that reached back.